Hi, Lou here, and this is a Compendium of Britannia-like games, a listing and description. There aren't many games that spawn a group of games using similar systems by different designers, but my game Britannia is one of them. I haven't even laid hands on some of these games. I have only played Britannia, Dual Britannia, and once Italia. Now, this will include both published and non-published games, the ones that I've been able to find. So the objective here is to talk briefly about each one, but it's still two parts because there's a lot to talk about altogether. And after I'd done most of this, I thought, well, maybe I should characterize Britannia first. Britannia is about migrations and organized invasions in pre-gunpowder times. It has a large area map, and it covers a very long time scale. It equates population with armies, which is a Dark Age characteristic. It has an economy. In other words, you don't just have units appearing, you can also build more according to what economy you've built up. The point scoring is by nation, and a player can control several nations. The player's nations cannot cooperatively attack or defend their separate nations. If they happen to be in the same place, they have to fight. There are no event cards. He uses dice combat. There are about 200 armies with no numbers on them, just an identifier of the nation. 4 players, sometimes also 3. Now, many of the following games deviate in one or more ways, even some of my games, from this list. So, we have a list of games. There are games of similar complexity, there are games that are more complex, and there are a few published games that are less complex. Actually, just one that's been published so far. I'm not listing the designers because I may not know or I may not remember. And since I moved house, I don't know where many of these games are in my house. Sorry about that, but most of them are on Board Game Geek. Most of the published ones anyway. So the first here is Ancient Conquest 1 and 2, and I list these first because Ancient Conquest 1 at least predates Britannia. I saw that game being played and read the rules sometime in the 70s, probably the very late 70s. And I borrowed the notion of several nations per player. But I don't let those nations cooperate, whereas in Ancient Conquest, the player moved all their nations at once and they could cooperate closely, even garrisoning the same city. Ancient Conquest was a hex and counter war game with numbers on the counters, hexagons, and so forth. Combat table as far as I can recall. It only had an order of battle, not an economy. In other words, you got pieces when you got them and that was it. What you did on the board didn't make any difference generally to how many pieces you could acquire. Ancient Conquest 1 and 2 share similar maps, the early and later history of the ancient Near East, ancient Middle East, and Eastern Europe. So it includes Greece, for example. Maharaja is the first that followed Britannia, and this was done by Avalon Hill some years after they published Britannia. It's a slavish imitation in some ways. For example, the same number of nations and the same number of land areas as Britannia. It has the problem of Indian history that all the invasions come from the northwest instead of from all around. One of the great advantages of Britannia is the invasions come from all around. Now, if you get into gunpowder days and the Europeans, then you've got invasions from the sea, but I think that's a big mistake. Nonetheless, it was done here, so late in the game you have the Europeans. Unfortunately, I've read that the designer died during the process, and maybe that had some effect on it. People say it's a good 3-player game, but not a good 4-player game. Chariot Lords is the ancient Near and Middle East. There is no economy. You get back a proportion of your dead. It has Random player order. You roll for the player order every turn, and that's horrible to me. It just makes a hash out of the whole business. But that's a matter of opinion, I suppose. Moreover, has possibly the most confused and unclear set of rules I have ever read, unfortunately. The Dragon and the Pearl covers pre-gunpowder Chinese history. It was published by a United Kingdom game shop with a plasticized map, plastic disc pieces with stickers coming in a cardboard tube. It's a pretty straightforward adaptation of the Britannia game system. While I've not played, I wouldn't be surprised if this is the best of the Brit-like games other than Britannia itself. Then we have Roos, in other words, Russia in early days, self-published long before Kickstarter. I've read some criticism of how it plays. I haven't tried it myself. It's a difficult subject, not one that I've even tried, and I've tried a hell of a lot. There's so much difference between the steppe and the forested areas of Russia, and of course the area the board covers extends well beyond Russia, not surprisingly. Hegemonia is about ancient Greece, Western Persia, and some of Italy. I've never seen the game, only images of the map and so forth. It was offered privately in Germany in a limited form. It could be print and play, I don't know. In fact, I'm not sure I know anybody who's ever seen it. China, the Middle Kingdom. This is Chinese history from ancient times, but it extends through the Chinese Civil War post-World War II. And once again, my view is the Britannia system doesn't model gunpowder era, let alone World War II. The system was made for gradual migrations, slow movement, and communication, where the population more or less created the army, none of which is true in gunpowder times. The game also suffers from what I can only call an egregious error. The playable board doesn't extend beyond China's modern boundaries. Think about that. Why would you do that? I don't know. So Mongolia, for example, is not part of the playable board. Korea is not playable. Vietnam is not playable. And yet those are areas that at times the Chinese dominated or actually controlled. But you can't play there. It introduced an idea with rebellions where, in order for one dynasty to be followed by another, you'd roll a lot of dice for each individual area to determine whether it went over to the new dynasty. It's also interesting in that the attackers have a permanent advantage over the defenders. Attackers hit on a 4, 5, or a 6. Defenders hit on a 5 or a 6. Hispania is the history of the Iberian Peninsula. The problem here is that at times the entire area was ruled by one government for decades or centuries. You had the Romans, you had the Visigoths, you had the Muslims, except for Asturias, which didn't amount to much at that point. How does the game cope with this? Well, the designer had his methods. This game is much more complex than Britannia, with something like 500 pieces and several more piece types. And I will continue to talk about these in part 2.